Yes, good afternoon. I'm Cindy DeWeese, the President and CEO of the Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce, and so happy to see your faces. You really don't know how much we miss hugs and humans around here. And so we're in the people business. We miss you all very much, but great to have you join us today for this. So as we get started, we want you to keep your cameras on today so we can see your faces. So it really feels like we're in a room together. Not really, but we're hoping it kind of feels that way. But if you'll mute, there we go, your audio, so then we can won't hear any background. We'll also have some questions. If you have questions through the presentation, feel free to use the chat feature. Our staff will be monitoring that, and we'll do Q&A after the presentation. So now I want to welcome our chair-elect, Bob Davey, with Greer, Hertz, and Adams. Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Cindy, and I appreciate everybody's participation in these unusual times. But I want to thank you, Cindy, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. And in particular, we ought to thank, and I have the pleasure of recognizing today's Spotlight sponsor, which is Texan Bank. And I know Texan Bank has been working hard to serve the community, and it's been working with the SBA and the Paycheck Protection Program applications. And Christy has noted some of their stats. During the first round of the PPP loans, Texas Bank was part of ensuring support to 189 local businesses. That's 189 with $36 million in funds and retained jobs of 3,958. And I think we should all thank Texan Bank. That's the way this is supposed to work. So thank you, Texan Bank, and thank you for supporting our chamber initiatives as a sponsor today. And let's give everybody a round of applause. All right. With the applause for that important thing, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Glenn Friedman. You may know him. He's the president of EduSafe Systems, Inc. And in addition to being a general bon vivant, he works primarily as a coach, a facilitator, and a speaker for boards of directors, educational agencies, companies, cities, chambers, and economic development organizations nationally and abroad, and he served on a number of them. So let's welcome Dr. Friedman. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Cindy. Thanks, everybody, for joining in the festivities today. And a big shout out and thank you to Texan Bank for everything you're doing to help bring our business community back. Your work right now is more important, perhaps, than it's ever been, and we very much appreciate it. Let's go to the slides. I want to tell you. First slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Today we're going to be chatting a little bit about making decisions during this crisis. And as you see in the second line about trusting our brain and our heart and our gut, let me give you a quick overview of what I mean by those three terms. And then we're going to get into the meat of the subject with a quick story and some examples. When we're talking about the brain, one way of looking at that, or your mind, is that it's how we observe the world. It's our logic and our reason and our ability to marshal stats and data to make sense of everything around us. When we talk about our heart, we're talking about reaching out to the world. It's everything from our emotions to the images we have, to our belief systems, to how we process information from other people, from television, social media, and so forth. And when we're talking about our gut, we're talking about engaging with the world. It's our instincts and our experiences and everything that we've ever had in our lives that would help lead us to make a decision. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little story about three people. The names have been changed to protect their innocence, but these are interviews that I've had over the last 2 or 3 weeks with different kinds of people who are exemplify the qualities that we're going to be talking about in a minute. So Bill stands for the brain, and Hank for the heart, and Gail for the gut. And I talked to Bill, I talked to all three, and they're all in the financial services industry, about when the pandemic might be over and what it might mean for their business. And when I talked to Bill, he said, well, the way I figure these things out is that I look at the Federal Reserve, I look at the data that comes out from the markets, I take a look at the stats that are coming from everything from the CDC to the federal government and every place I can find them, the stock market results from the previous day and how those are all moving up and down. And then I take a look and say, all right, what does this mean for me? And I said, well, what does it mean for you? And he said, I don't have a clue. Well, when will the pandemic be over? I don't know. Talked to Hank. Said, Hank, when is all of this going to be over? And Hank said, well, let me tell you what I do. I watch everything I can. I watch Bloomberg, I watch CNBC, I watch CNN, I watch Fox, I watch everything. I keep up with my friends in the business. We talk every day. We know what's going on. We share information. And I think I'm pretty well up to speed on everything that's going on. And so I ask him the same questions. What are you going to do? I don't know, says he. When's this going to be over? I don't know, says he. Then I talk to Gail. And I asked Gail, when's this all going to be over? And Gail, predictably, said, well, I've been through this stuff before. I went through the Great Recession. I've been through 2 hurricanes around here, Ike and Harvey. I've seen it all and been back around again. And so I'm ready. Well, what are you guys going to do? I don't know. When's it going to be over? I don't know. Moral of the story is, for making decisions in a time like now, the case I'm going to make to all of you is very simple. Use every tool at your disposal. Use your brain, use your heart, use your gut, and I hope in the next few slides and in the next few minutes, I'll be able to give you a sense of how to make sense of what's going on. Next slide, please. I want to start with a few assumptions, and some of it is you can't see because I hope you can see the whole slide. If not, I'll tell you what's there. First assumption is right at the top, is that there are many acceptable decisions. There's a tendency when we're talking to people about making decisions that they want to come to whatever it is they think is the right answer. There are many possible acceptable decisions, and we'll get to some of that in a few minutes. And looking at the screen, if you go over to the left, what I'm also saying as an assumption is that trial and error in a time like right now is not usually possible. This is not the sort of thing where you can say, well, let's test it out and see what happens, because businesses are at stake. In some cases, lives are at stake. And so what I'm going to be thinking about and encouraging as we go through and talk about these decisions is that we begin to think in terms of probability and likelihoods of things occurring, rather than saying that there's just one way and we have a yes or no decision. And when we're talking about probabilities, for example, that there's a 60% chance that such and such will happen, or a 90% chance, or a 10% chance, that we can begin to talk to one another and have conversations that are a little bit more fruitful, in my opinion, than if we're just all trying to find something we call the right answer. Over there on the other side of the screen on the right side, it says that there are many ways to evaluate every decision. And we're going to have to talk about that a little bit, because what I have found in talking to businesses the last 2 months is that people are so caught up in the moment that they're not taking a look at all of the ways that they can assess the information that's coming to them. And we'll look at that. Next is setting priorities, because some questions to answer and some issues to address are more important, some are more urgent, and which ones we choose to address are going to make a big difference in how we proceed. We'll look at that too. And last but not least, down at the bottom, making the decision is just the beginning. Making a decision is not the end of the process, it's the kickoff. Next slide, please. This is something that is a little university-ish, and that those of you who know me know that that's where I come from, so bear with me on this one. This is called a cone of uncertainty. And what it means in very general terms is that as we're making decisions, one of the things that we're going to do is play them out in our minds and play them out with our colleagues so that we can get a sense not only of what might make the most sense to do right now, but what makes the most sense to do for the long haul. We don't know how long this pandemic will last. One of the questions that I've been asking to all of the people that I've been working with over the last few months, the businesses that I've been talking to by phone or Zoom or whatever, I've asked them what the indicator will be, as I mentioned before, about when this will be over. And the answers vary wildly. One indication of this is just watching how the federal and state government are unfolding with each passing week, new guidelines. The governor, in fact, came out with some just on Monday that begins to open up the state of Texas. Is this the first thing, the last thing he's going to do? Probably not. Is he going to roll some back? We don't know. Is he going to open up some more? We don't know. So we're all playing out these scenarios, trying to make a decision about what's going to be best for our particular business at this particular time. I'll give you my definition of when the pandemic will be over. And it's very simple. The pandemic will be over when we have an effective, affordable, widely available vaccine.
Yeah.
That goes way beyond any one business. But it's when we'll have the confidence that the pandemic, this particular pandemic, is over. Now, what does that mean for our business? Well, it might mean we have 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Every day I read a different story in the paper or hear a different story about when that vaccine might be coming. So for our business at this time, let's begin to think about playing out our scenarios over time and adjusting our decisions as we go forward. Next slide, please. And this is what that looks like. We're going to be making decisions, and where the X's are things we decide not to do, and we'll move forward along a path. And notice that the direction, we're moving in our direction of making businesses work, but it's a torturous path. And sometimes there are going to be breaks where new information comes in and we have to rethink what we're doing. And I think that chart is fairly well self-explanatory, so let's move on. Next slide, please. This is the beginning of the decision-making process. That every decision starts with a question.
Yeah.
It doesn't start with a problem, it doesn't start with a solution, and it doesn't start with a quick answer. It starts with a question. Whatever our question is going to lead us down a particular path. Let's take a look at a couple of these questions that are listed at the bottom. One question refers to a business, the next one refers to a personal decision. At the bottom it says, when can I reopen? And that's one kind of question. That's a very specific question. When can I reopen? Now that's less vital today even than it was when I created this slide, because some things are already going to be open. But when can I reopen sets a date. It's very specific. Another question is, how can I stay open? If a person's mindset is the business has never closed, now we may have had to furlough people, we may have to do something, but if my mindset is I'm still in business, how do I stay open? How do I stay in business? All of a sudden that question becomes very different than when can I reopen? If we apply the same kind of logic to the question at the bottom, and I can't read it on my screen here, so I'll read it from my slide deck. How can I stop being so bored? Which is another one I've heard over and over from folks. That's a very different kind of question than the one on the bottom right, which is what new thing can I learn to do? One is, geez, I'm bored and I can't put up with it anymore. The other is, well, what are the options out there for me to take a look at? And so how we frame or reframe the question is something that we have control over. It's the mindset that we bring into the decision-making process. And as we'll see in a minute or two, how that mindset affects everything that we do. There's a classic case that's a part of the Harvard business cases it's called the elevator model. And here's the problem that was set out. There was an elevator in a building that moved too slowly. And the occupants of that business building were upset because they had to wait so long for the elevator to come up and down, pick them up, get them to their floor. And they were complaining continually to the landlord, to the maintenance people about that building. And so the folks who owned the building then said, well, what's the solution? And they started to ask the tenants in the building and the people who came to the building. And you wouldn't be surprised at the answers they came up with. Well, we need a new motor. We need new fittings. We got to get a whole new elevator system. We need to move this to the outside of the building or to the inside of the building. And they brought in a guy from Harvard. I know this is a shocker. And he said to them, well, let's look at this a different way. Let's take a look at it from the standpoint of the people who are riding the elevator. And to make a long story short, what they did was put mirrors outside the elevators. And when they put the mirrors up, the people started looking at themselves and they started checking their hair and their clothing and their everything else. And they forgot about the speed of the elevator. So instead of spending tens of thousands of dollars or whatever it costs to refit an elevator, they threw up a few $100s in mirrors on every floor, and everybody seemed to be happy, and the number of complaints dropped significantly. In the Harvard view of these things, that is called reframing, taking a look at the problems from a very different perspective. Next slide, please. So what are the kinds of questions that we could ask when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic? And they're listed here. I'm not going to spend time reading what's on the screen, but they're listed here. And we can ask questions both about the business that we have and about the people. And we may be asking multiple questions. My point here is very simple. The questions that we ask will lead us to the decisions that we make. When we ask any number of questions, and then we take a look at it through the lens of whether we're using our head, our brain, or our heart, or our gut, what we can begin to do is take a look at alternative decisions that we can match or align to get a sense of confidence in terms of the probabilities of success. So it isn't a simple yes, no. It's a process of working with others and thinking through some of these issues from a variety of different perspectives to make sense of it and to come up with a scenario that is most likely to produce a probability of success. Next slide, please. Now, no matter what the question is, there's always context. I'm not going to go through all of these. This just gives an example of what the context may be for any given business. And as an aside, if these are slides that you happen to want, the Chamber has them and we'll be pleased to send them out to you. Obviously, Cindy is also looking forward to your renewal check coming back to her, and that's entirely between you and the Chamber. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about making decisions and these processes that I've been referring to. And to repeat or to review, when we talk about the head or our brain, we're talking about research and data and analysis and model building and so forth. And you can see all of these. And then down at the bottom is the goal, what we want to do. And the metaphor that I'm using here is a light bulb. And for those of you who know me, you know that there's nothing I like more than a rotten little metaphor. Let's go to the next slide. So let's take a look at making decisions using our head. Here are a couple examples of questions that at least have come up in my chats with different business owners and different groups over the last couple of months. They're questions like, how many staff can I afford to keep? Or how long can I stay in business given the current environment, whatever that happens to be for a given organization. And it varies tremendously from group to group. And you can see that the process that we use in making a decision with that kind of question involves focusing the question, taking a look at the sources of data, and having some tools to analyze these. In terms of the staff, we would need to know about the staff. We would need to know how many we have and about the dollars involved and so forth. But one of the interesting things that came up, at least as I was talking to folks, is that when people think of staff, they tend to start by thinking about human beings first and not the business as a whole. So once we got started taking a look at the notion of staff, then the kinds of questions that come up is, well, what is the total cost of retaining a staff person? Because it's not just salary, it's also benefits. It's also whatever it takes to keep them in their workplace, technology and other kinds of things that may be involved. It may be other sorts of benefits that a person has. It varies from company to company, obviously, or organization to organization, but it also gets into who's doing what kinds of jobs and those general HR issues. And so as we get into these sorts of questions, at one level, it asks us to use the data to make relatively straightforward decisions. At another level, it asks us to reframe and to begin to ask other sorts of questions that can benefit our business. I'll give you one quick example, a company I had a chance to work with, a security company. They do various kinds of security for organizations. And one of the things that they found is that they changed their business model once they started looking at staffing and moved people from full-time to part-time and whatever they could do. They ended up asking the very basic question of what kind of business model do we have now and what kind of business model do we want to move forward with? And they ended up finding themselves being more proactive in how they would build partnerships with other businesses, organizations, homeowners associations, all sorts of other groups, rather than dealing with folks individually or one by one. They brought in the whole team, and they've been able to keep everybody on staff and working because they've transformed a business model simply by taking a look at some of these human resource questions and who was doing what. And what they also found was that the team was smarter than anyone ever gave them credit for, because while they were hired to do a particular kind of work, they wanted to keep their jobs, and they were very active and interested in moving forward. So I think you get a sense, right, of the sort of question we're asking with using our brain, where we can gather specific sets of data and how those can spin out. Next slide, please. This is another example of a brain question. It's called, I'm calling it model building. This has gotten a lot of interest with everybody from restaurants and hotels and other kinds of service organizations, where we start talking about supply chains. And a supply chain obviously is how our goods and services are transmitted across the boundary lines of organization to organization. How do we get things? How do we distribute things, and so forth? I'm sure you all know what those things are. But all of a sudden, supply chains have been broken. Companies are not working, or companies, the transportation systems aren't available that had been available before. Probably the best example of taking a look at supply chains that are working to some extent are grocery stores, the H-E-Bs and Krogers and so forth. As some of you may have read, H-E-B is one of the national leaders in developing crisis management plans to sustain their operations in a period of a pandemic like this one. I think you're going to see H-E-B used as a national model for the next half dozen years at least on how to handle these things. But one of the cornerstones of what they did was to build models on their supply chain. How do we get things out? How do we bring things in? How do we move things out? And then another way of looking at model building is in the marketing strategies. Company after company have found that the traditional marketing strategies that they have been using aren't sufficient. So they're moving more to internet, social media based plans. They're using other sources of advertising. And I'm seeing it in chambers all over the state. How many businesses are using their chambers and their contacts to help increase their business? The chambers are more important than they've ever been. And now an editorial message. Support having PPP for chambers. Cindy, you have anything you want to say to that? Thumbs up from
Just
Cindy.
amen. Just
There you go.
amen.
Chambers are serving a more vital role in cities, especially small towns, than they ever have. And obviously, the Clear Lake Area Chamber is the single best chamber in the history of mankind. But the process is the same kind of process we started with, which is a focus question, and then to begin to build a model. This is a lot of fun because you get to draw stuff on envelopes and backs of napkins and things. But creating models, creating little drawings, creating whatever it takes to outline how things work, and then begin to consider all of the elements that are a part of it, what's working, what's not working, how we can modify it, who else can help, and so forth. And this is also a point in which talking to other businesses, getting people's advice after you built the model, and allows you to modify and strengthen that model as you move forward. This is something that at least for me, I've spent a lot of time on the phone with people lately, talking about the models of how things work. And it has amazed me. In fact, somebody on this call may be a part of those conversations, I'm not sure, but it has amazed me that when you're the head of an organization, how little you may know about how stuff really works down in the weeds. You know, the people who are getting stuff done, and in large organizations where you've got procurement over here and you've got HR over there and you've got marketing around the corner, a lot of moving parts make these groups work. And when I say a large organization right now, I'm talking about anybody who's got more than 50 people. This is a small business in federal terms, and certainly a small business, you know, the under 500s in traditional terms. But it doesn't take that many people for specialization to occur. So model building is the second one of these areas that starts with using our brains and the data that are available to us. Next slide, please. Now we have, and I'm just because I like alliteration, with the heart, and that's friends, foes, and Facebook. What are we hearing from people in groups we like, and what are we hearing from the folks we don't like as much? And when I say Facebook, I'm talking about all of social media, because everybody likes to comment about everything from behind the shield of the internet. So what kinds of questions could we ask? Well, one that's burning in the city right now and in the state is about masks. Should everyone wear a mask? That same grocery store I mentioned a minute ago, H-E-B, wants everybody to wear a mask when they come in. If you're running a small business of any sort, what are your liabilities now? And who knows about these things? And what are they saying? And what are lawyers saying? And one of the things we find, no offense, Davey, if you have 5 lawyers, you could very easily have 5 opinions. So bringing all of this data together becomes rather difficult, and it can become contradictory, but they're important decisions to make. So we're asking ourselves what others are doing, what they think we should do, how emotional is this decision? And there are many, many occasions in which the decisions that we make are emotional. That's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just a thing. So we have to take a look at where we're getting our information, how trusted that information is, and all the rest that people talk about in critical thinking classes. But the process becomes assessing our engagement, our emotional engagement, and what our biases happen to be. Assessing those sources, as I mentioned a minute ago, and the implications of what that data happen to be. In times of difficulty, it is very often as important to listen to the people who are not saying the popular thing or the thing that happens to jibe with my belief system, for the simple reason that we want to get a 360-degree view of whatever it is that we're going to be deciding. And so it's important to hear what people have to say, but it's equally important to assess it so that it works for us. One of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has brought out is how different areas are. So we may talk about New York City in one breath, and we may talk about rural West Texas in another breath, and how different those groups are in terms of the effect of this pandemic. But even at a more micro level, if we're sitting here in the Clear Lake area, the data seem to indicate that there are not nearly as many cases of COVID-19 as there are in other parts of town. If we're in Galveston County, what we're seeing is that League City and Galveston have the majority of the cases, and there are many fewer cases in the center part of the county. So if I've got a business, I've also got this context to take a look at, and in talking to people from New York City, I may have a very different view than talking to somebody from League City or Texas City or any place else that ends in city. Next slide, please. And now let's take a look at our gut. One way of assessing things based on our experience and based on our insights from the past and so forth is what's called future back. Well, maybe it isn't called future back. I may have made that up. But what future back is going out to whatever the desired state is that we're looking at, and then defining what we have now. In other words, it's down there in the process, defining the future state, coming back and taking a look at what our present state is, and then building a bridge between the two based on our experience, based on what other people say, based on the data, whatever it happens to be. One of the reasons this becomes important is in an environment like we have now with a pandemic, we don't know how long this is going to last. And I keep hearing people talk about new normals and old normals and normal normals and all these other normals. Well, from a business standpoint, that isn't really helpful because no two of us have exactly the same normal. So what do we want to do really? Do we want to get back to the gross revenues that we had at a certain point? Do we want to have a percentage increase? What exactly is it that we want to have? And let's put that out there on the table and take a look at where we are now and begin to develop a strategy that will move us from where we are now to where we want to be. Now, it could turn out, like the federal government is saying right now, that this is going to be a moving target. The data that came out this morning was that the economy declined by 4% in the first quarter of 2020, and they're anticipating somewhere between 20 to 30% decline in the overall economy in the second quarter of this year. That's a phenomenal set of numbers. So what do we want to get back to? And what's the indicator going to be? Is the indicator going to be the stock market? Probably not. For my business, it's not. Is the indicator going to be what the average unemployment level is going to be? Not for my business, it's probably not. So what are the data that we want to put out there that are going to be important to us that will help guide us as we move forward in our business decisions? And building that bridge is, again, another way of involving a lot of different people and involving a lot of different ways of thinking about things. Next slide, please. And then the other generally understood way of taking advantage of our gut or our experiences or our understanding of how the world works is the look back, look forward. In other words, let's take a look back at what went on before and let's extrapolate out into the future. So if I look back on the 20th century, just the last 20 years, I've had to deal in the world I live in, 9/11, unending wars, a Great Recession, Ike and Harvey, other natural disasters around the country, fires in California, and on and on and on. The pandemic is now just one more thing. And depending on how you count it, this is either the second or third pandemic, Ebola and SARS and so forth, of this century, for goodness sake. Now, what have I learned from all of that? And does any of it apply to right now? I always get a good laugh when I hear somebody on the television or the radio say, here's Joe Schmo. He bought Apple computer when it was $1.13. You should listen to him now. Why? I have no reason to listen to him now. The guy got lucky once. Why would I listen to him now? That doesn't tell me what to buy or what not to buy. Now the question becomes, I've lived through Harvey. I flooded. I had a business shutdown. What did I learn from that that I can apply now? Is it exactly the same? Probably not. Is it going to offer some lessons learned that I can use? Probably so. And let's begin to take a look at what those are. What lessons have we learned? How do they apply to this current situation? How do we monitor that? How do we adjust as we move forward? So all of those different areas begin to help us develop a sense of how we can make decisions based on very, very different sorts of questions. Next slide, please. All right, so where are we so far? Well, one of the things we did as we got started here was we began to look at some of the kinds of assumptions that we make when we start to ask questions about recovering from a pandemic like the one we have now. Those assumptions lead us to begin to ask one or more questions about the decisions that we're going to make and to give ourselves a frame or a way of looking at our issues, the problems that we want to solve, in a manageable way. Then we take a look at the context that we're in. And then we apply the toolkit that we have, all of the tools that we have. But what I haven't talked about, and what's equally important in this decision-making, in these processes, is how do we begin to communicate what we're doing and how we're doing it to the people who matter, to our staff, to our customers, to our business partners, whoever they may be. How do we engage the people who are important to us to keep us moving? And those people may be our accountants, our banks, our lawyers, the other services that we rely on day in and day out, payroll and other sorts of groups, so that they know what we're doing, they can help transmit information. And these are ongoing conversations with people. And having those conversations is as important a part of the decision-making and feedback process as anything could be. And last but not least is the follow-through. One of the reasons why thinking in terms of probabilities rather than yes, no's or right, wrong, one of the reasons that thinking in terms of probabilities becomes so important is that it allows us to adjust as we talk to more people, as we draw on more experiences, as we gather more data, that we can increase or decrease the probabilities of success as we move forward and make decisions, or as new information comes in, it helps us to adjust to meet the changing times. The document that the governor put out the other day was remarkable to me. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do, because it is a phased approach to helping business get started in an environment in which there's incredible uncertainty. Some of you may be aware that the military loves acronyms. And one of the acronyms that came out of the Army War College is VUCA, V-U-C-A. VUCA stands, the V is volatility. The U is uncertainty. The C is complexity. And the A is ambiguity. And what the military is saying, that in situations of extreme VUCA, with all of these different areas of uncertainty and difficulty that we have to deal with, and we're in that series, we're there now. One of the things that we begin to learn is how we have to be flexible, resilient enough to adjust as we move forward and to take advantage of all of the tools at our disposal. No one is intrinsically better than others, although they may be drawn on in different ways and in a different order, depending on the question that we ask. And then over there on the right side, some takeaways from this little conversation. One is that each tool can contribute. The 5 tools that I presented on this light bulb in order to reach the target, but they all are worth trying, and they're all worth talking with folks about, because the conversation can be as enlightening or as much fun as arriving at any one decision. The second bullet down here about having a crisis plan is one that, at least for me, I've been disappointed in how few groups I've had a chance to talk to. And again, I certainly don't mean that I've talked to, 900 out of every 1,000 organizations or anything like that. But how few groups have a crisis plan. And one guy, I'm not kidding, I said, we were talking about crisis plans, and I said, do you have a crisis plan for your IT? And he said, yes, I call my IT guy. Well, okay. IT guy's at home. He can't come to the office. He can't, this is a different situation. So what does a crisis plan look like? What happens if the head of a company is a casualty of COVID-19? Is there a succession plan? Is there a recovery plan? And so a lesson learned already is that a decision coming out of this will be to take the lessons that you're learning now, write them down, and begin to incorporate that into a crisis plan. And that's as important for the federal government as the state government, as the local government, as your company or any nonprofit that may be out there. Because the 20th century has taught us we're going to have one crisis after another, and they're very different kinds. Next one, communication is important as the decision itself, how to get people on board, how do we incorporate all of this information. There are some groups that always want unanimity in every decision that's made. Some groups are, the Lincoln team of rivals, where we bring people together and we have pros and cons and we bat everything around. What's the model for communicating, and what's the model for decision-making in your organization? And again, there's not a right answer, but there is an answer that will lead to a probability of higher success for any given group. But last but not least, if you're the head of the organization, you own the decision. That's not always easy. To what extent are you willing to stand behind the decisions that you make? Can you explain the decisions that you make? Are you comfortable enough to explain the decisions that you make? And that little sound is my indicator that I've hit my limit. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you who have stayed through this. I'd like to thank all of you who went to the restroom and then came back. I'd like to thank all of you for your time and attention. And I'm not quite sure how we want to handle questions, but I'm ready, willing, and able. Cindy, Bob, and Montoya, and anything you want to do, just let me know. Thanks, everybody. Hello, Deborah.
Well, I don't see that we have, well, we've got some questions in the chat, and I think Sherry, our Vice President, Sherry Sweeney, and Bob Davey, our Chair-elect, are going to handle those questions.
Oh, good. Will they answer them too?
Those, well, I think so. I think that.
I can tell you the same thing I told my kids. I'll give you an answer.
There you go. And thanks for closing it on that note that at the head of the organization, you got to own it. Thanks for that, Glenn. That was really encouraging. But no, really, if we don't have any questions, we will move on. Thank you so much, Glenn. We appreciate your insight and your willingness to always work with not only our chamber, but chambers around the state and the country. We appreciate you very, very much.
Cindy, if I can just interrupt real quick.
Please.
We are going to, Montea's going to put this up on YouTube. We will have the slide PDF that Glenn put together. If anyone does look at that, then come up with some questions, or in the middle of the night, wake up and have some wondering, just email me and I'll be happy to get it to Glenn and hook you guys up that way. That's something very easy for us to do, and Glenn is always willing to help everybody out. So something may jar in your head, because this was a lot of great information, but the questions may come later. So we're happy to help.
And I would add just one other thing. The chat questions, the chat is pretty good. I've noticed somebody's talked about the Texas Monthly article on HEB.
Right.
We've got a link to the governor's executive order. So there's a lot of good information floating around if anybody wants to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you, Rob and Kathy.
And who, yeah, are they the ones who posted it?
Yes.
Thank you, guys. That's really helpful. And it's a great example of how powerful this technology can be, that, you know, we bring something up and it immediately somebody has a way to access that information. That's fantastic.
Right. Who knew we would be doing this so quickly? We talked about webinars, you know, in some of our planning sessions. We thought, oh, we're not ready for that. Clearly we are.
Well,
So,
and
here we
Cindy,
are.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me to do this at a time when you don't have to pay for my lunch.
I think I owe you lunch now, don't you think?
Yes.
I'm
We're
just
gonna
kidding.
have to go.
It's
I would,
a
I would
joke.
love to be paying for your lunch right now.
It's a joke, Cindy.
I know. So I'm going to talk about some upcoming events tomorrow. We're thrilled to have Senator Larry Taylor for a webinar at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Senator Taylor is going to talk to us about Texas getting back to business and also participate in some Q&A. So in addition to tomorrow, we're going to have our business after hours, virtual, of course, at 4 o'clock. So bring a glass of wine or a glass of beer and join us for that, and a snack or two, some cashews, right, Amy? Oh, she disappeared. And so please join us for one of those meetings if you can. Next week, we're going to hear from Dr. Glenn Friedman again for our business development seminar on Tuesday. And then our young professionals are getting together for their monthly lunch bunch, virtually, of course, on Wednesday. So Kat, are you going to be there for that? Good. In addition, we're making an announcement very soon on the rescheduled dates for our special events that were canceled: the golf tournament, the Business and Wellness Expo, and the ever popular bowling tournament. So keep your eye out.
They were postponed. We're not saying the canceled word. That word is
Did I
not
say
in the
canceled?
chamber. They were
I say
postponed.
cancel. Uh-oh. So the rescheduled dates. Anyway, keep an eye out for those emails, and you can put those back in your calendar. And again, another big thank you to Texan Bank for sponsoring today's general membership meeting. If you are interested in sponsoring one of our webinars, please contact one of the staff for more information. And with that, I think we've wrapped it up. So great job on our first virtual general membership meeting. I think we had about 57 on the call at the high point, and we appreciate you participating. And Glenn, thanks again. You're awesome, as always.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have
Thank
a
you,
great
Bob.
day, everyone.
Thanks.